for letting me have the floor for a few minutes. First of all, Madam President, I'd like to say that Dr. Barrasso's second opinion is clearly the opinion of Missourians, and I think when you ask Americans if they want to see changes in the health care system, but not these changes, they say, yes, we want the health care system to be changed. We just don't want it changed this way. I'd remind the chair that in Missouri, in the primary election in August last year, 72% of the people who voted said they didn't want to be part of this health care plan. This is going to be a big discussion and a big issue for the next couple of years until we decide what direction we're going to take. Today I want to talk about spending. These two bills are going to come to the floor today about spending, and there'll be lots of discussions about the cuts that the House made, the $61 billion of cuts, and how this cut could have been better, how this is a good thing for the government or for somebody to do. And of course, I suspect that most all of that will be true. What's unfortunate is that we don't get to talk about on the Senate floor today what we might cut instead of this thing that will be, these things will be discussed that people think are such a good idea for us to continue. The truth is we have to make the kinds of decisions that get spending under control. This year we're going to spend about $3.8 trillion. We're going to collect about $2.2 trillion. And even though $1 trillion is too big a concept to wrap your mind around, everybody understands that 3.8 is a lot bigger than 2.2. If your business was spending $3.8 million and bringing in $2.2 million, you'd understand that your business wasn't going to be in business very much longer. If your family was spending $38,000 and bringing in the door $22,000, you'd know that that couldn't continue. And this can't continue either. And the idea that we can't make $61 billion of reductions in spending in a $3.8 trillion budget, $1.6 trillion of which is deficit spending, just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to the American people. And we're going to have a government that can make choices. Right now, we've got government trying to do the same thing over and over again at all three levels. And some of those things that government's trying to do at the federal, the state, and the local level ought to be left to families when they could be left to families. And other things are the legitimate job of government. But everything is not the legitimate job of the federal government. And almost nothing is the legitimate job of all levels of government. We'd be much better off if we'd try to go through this process. Okay, is this a problem that only government can solve? And if the answer is yes, then the next question is, well, can't we solve that problem closer to where people live and work and where the problem is, where families are? Can't we solve that at the city level or the county level? And well, maybe the answer is no. And then the question should be, well, can't we solve it at the state level? And then the question should be, well, if we're going to solve it at the federal level, is there really a constitutional definition that allows us to do that? And there are some things that only the federal government can do, but there aren't very many things that only the federal government can do. We're going to hear in this discussion today and in the coming weeks about lots of good things that can be done in our society. We're going to hear about some things that I've worked to authorize and try to get us to make a priority and would still hope they could be a priority. Some of those programs are actually cut in the House appropriation bill that I'll vote for today, because my view is that we have to cut spending. And if we could cut the $61 billion this year, that exactly what I wanted to cut, that would be better for me. But I am committed to cut spending in any bill that we can get enough people to put a bill on the president's desk that will say, let's head toward a balanced budget. Let's get a balanced budget amendment. Let's head toward a balanced budget, but let's ask the right questions. You know, before I came to the Congress, I was a university president for 4 years. It was a private university, Southwest Baptist University in Bolivar, Missouri. We didn't take any federal money or any state money. We had to pay our bills. And because we had to pay our bills, as the president of the university, I was constantly being asked to do things that were good things to do, But I had several different categories of no, this is why we can't do that. And maybe the two that we ought to use the most often in Washington, D.C. these days is no, that's a good idea, but it's not what we do. I said that a lot as a university president. Matter of fact, in the 4 years I was there, I never had anybody come to me and ask me to do anything evil. I never had anybody come to me, president of Southwest Baptist University, and say, here's something really bad that I think we should do as an institution. Every idea that I got was a good idea, but it wasn't always something we could do. So one of my categories of no is, no, that's a good idea, but that's not what we do. And we're going to hear lots of things about people with challenges that somebody should help, but the federal government is $1.6 trillion in debt this year. This year, not the $14 trillion of accumulated debt, 1.6 this year. 200 over billion last month. Last month's deficit was within striking range of the annual deficit for the 10 years that ended in 2008. We are now spending more in deficit spending in a month than for a decade we spent in a year. If you average out that 10 years, it's very close to the February. And by the way, February is the shortest month. That's the only, we have 28 days of spending, and we set a record on monthly deficit spending for the United States of America that was almost equal to the average annual deficit of the previous 10 years. And sometimes people come to me and they'd say, well, they'd have a really good idea that actually was something the university could do. And often then I'd have to say, well, that's a good idea. We ought to think about how we could do that, but you're going to have to help me figure out what we can stop doing so we can start doing this. This may, in fact, be a better thing than some of the things we're doing now, but we just can't do everything. You know, families deal with this issue all the time. You just can't do everything, even if it would be good to see those things done. And the federal government is doing the wrong thing when it heads down a road spending so much more than you're collecting. Now, one obvious answer is, well, let's just collect more. And I suppose if you went to the Congressional Budget Office and said, what would the collection amount be for the federal government if the tax rate was 100%? Since they don't do any dynamic storing over there, they score as if tax policy doesn't matter. I guess they could add up all the payrolls of America, and whatever they added up to, that's how much money the federal government would bring in if the tax rate was 100%. But that would not happen. And frankly, the tax rate of collecting the $2.2 trillion is about all that we ought to be collecting out of this economy. For the 65 years after World War II, the government spent an average of about $1 out of 5 that the federal government, that the economy could create. Well, now we're spending $1 out of 4. And there's a big difference in a country where the federal government alone spends $1 out of 4 that the country can create in goods and services, as opposed to $1 out of 5. You're not going to get a lot more on the taxing side, so we have to make the reductions in spending. And then you're going to hear, well, we're just making these reductions out of 12 or 15% of the budget. Is that fair? Well, first of all, that's the only part of the budget that we can get to without significant legislative activity that should be the next thing on our agenda. Let's talk about the 60% of the budget that we normally don't even talk about, where if you meet the definition of the program, you get the money, and see if we can't figure out how to produce better results for fewer dollars. That's what everybody else in America has been thinking about for 20 years now. If you're still in business in America and you're competing in a global economy, you've been thinking, how do we get a better result for less money, not how do we spend more money. We need to be sure that the government is as good as the people it serves in that regard. And 12 or 15% of the budget, we're talking about reducing spending by $61 billion. That wouldn't begin to be nearly proportionate out. That's about 1/7 of the budget. If you multiply that by seven, you're still well over $1 trillion short of where you need to be. So we need to start by taking at least this much money out of that part of the budget and figure out how we can also make the government work better in the other 85% of the budget. This is